One of the biggest mistakes you may be making as either a nursing student or a graduate student is that you are not using effective studying techniques.
Everybody does it.
Some of the most commonly used study techniques are completely ineffective. In this episode, we are going over multiple research studies that are going to demonstrate ineffective, moderately effective, and the most effective study techniques. The effective study techniques are at the end, so make sure you stay till the end of the episode. Chrissy, do you want to kick it off with the least effective studying techniques on the market?
Yes, I would. So, first and foremost, the biggest myth to bust around studying and learning is the myth of learning styles. Have you ever said to yourself, oh, I'm a visual learner or I'm an auditory learner?
I'm a kinesthetic learner.
What does that even mean? There is no evidence to support that that is a useful tool for learning at all. Yes, we all have preferences and how we like to absorb information and things we might enjoy, but there is absolutely no research or data to back up that that improves your retention of knowledge or knowledge gain when it comes to actually taking in new information. So there was a study that was done to demonstrate this. We're actually going to put a screenshot up on the screen and we're going to link it in the description below as well if you're on YouTube. So the study was by the authors Massa and Mayer. This was in 2006, and it was actually a battery of studies. They had 3 separate studies, but the TLDR is that the short version is that they essentially studied multiple groups of people and looked to assess their learning style. And they broke down whether they were visual learners or auditory learners, for example, and then they taught them new information in different ways. They wanted to see if taking in new information in your own preferred learning style resulted in better scores, better learning, better retention, and they found no difference across the groups, even when they structured the study in 3 different ways.
Wow.
Yeah. Instead of focusing on taking in information in ways that you think are better for you, focus on study techniques that are actually backed by science, which, of course, we're going to get into in this episode.
It's really wild to me because that is such a pervasive myth, even within higher education. Most of my faculty will say things like, oh, well, most of you are, kinesthetic learners, so you need to just be in the sim lab and practice over and over, which in relation to skills, yes, you do need to do repetition, but the takeaway from this first study is that it's all about integration and actually doing evidence-based things. Like, you are not going to not learn something because you are a visual learner or you're an auditory learner, because let's be real, what's the difference between auditory and visual if it's a lecture, right? You're watching and listening to the lecture at the same time.
Well, not only that, everyone's a kinesthetic learner. 100% of people on the planet need to practice a fine motor skill in order to develop a fine motor skill. That doesn't have to do with your learning style. That has to do with the way that new skills are acquired.
It's so interesting. So that's myth number 1, is learning styles are a myth, which then leads us into point number 2. What are some of the least effective studying techniques? This is maybe not going to surprise you if you have watched any studying YouTube videos, but highlighting and underlining is one of the worst uses of your time as a student. You're going to mark up your textbook and decrease its value, and you are not going to learn anything from that. Highlighting, even though it might be very pretty, your Instagram post might be beautiful if you're a big highlighter and underliner, but that is not helping you transfer knowledge from the textbook to your brain. You might as well be doing that osmosis thing where you just hold it up to your brain and you hope that it gets in there somehow. That is going to be an ineffective use of your time.
Not only that, it can actually help you micro-focus on the wrong things instead of reading in between the lines and naturally summarizing the take-home points. And it can also, what I used to do when I would highlight is I would end up highlighting almost the entire page. It's just, you end up kind of over-marking, again, wasting time on something that's not really relevant to your learning, and then getting micro-focused on either niche points or too many points instead of just absorbing the main concept or main ideas.
You get lost in the weeds, which then really relates to some of the points later in this episode. You have to have a base understanding of a topic before you move into any of the key information extraction through whatever technique we're going to talk about. If you don't understand what the topic is, you can't highlight, summarize, do spaced repetition. You have to have a base understanding of a topic first. And highlighting is not going to help you get there, which then leads into, I think, Chrissy's favorite or least favorite.
The one that it just like aggravates me the most. So the authors call it keyword mnemonic. And that is this concept where you create some sort of imagery to represent a take-home point or a concept. So this was the one that irked me most in nursing school. I'm sure you've seen it. Blue bloaters and pink puffers to demonstrate emphysema versus COPD. This grinds my gears so much because when
Chrissy wakes up in the morning and she's like, oh.
I rage against this. So the reason why this doesn't work, this concept of creating a visual to represent a concept and as like a memory retrieval tool, is that it actually creates an extra step in the memory retrieval process for your brain when it comes to test day. So I get a question about, I'm learning about COPD, and for emphysema versus chronic bronchitis, you have one is the blue bloater and one is the pink puffer, and there's a picture of two different gentlemen who one is like hunched over and blue and wheezing, and the other is like inflated and bloated looking and pink, and these are supposed to represent different aspects of the pathophysiology of the two different types of COPD. Well, when it comes to test day, you get a question about COPD, and then now instead of just thinking about how the pathophysiology actually works, you're decoding in your brain. You're trying to figure out which one was the blue guy, which one was the pink guy.
And I think as you're explaining it,
what
you
did it mean
up
again?
Which one was pink and which one was blue, which is hilarious. Yes, you did. Because
blue bloater!
It's blue bloater
yes,
and pink
blue's
puffer.
fat. And then, so exactly.
So it demonstrates, like, what is the takeaway from that? The takeaway from that is that you're trying to, like, recall what this image is in your mind, and
you've created extra steps.
And you create an extra step, and you actually don't understand the pathophysiology at baseline. This is different from other sorts of visual recall, which we'll talk about later, and it is uniquely ineffective because it's a picture of, like,
nothing.
So this is a no.
This is a no. No keyword mnemonic for you.
The next one that really just doesn't particularly work is rereading alone. So you might see the people who are in nursing school particularly who just go back and they reread a chapter over and over and over again. But again, if you don't have a baseline understanding of what the concepts are, and then you're not moving into the more effective studying techniques, rereading a 40-page chapter is going to be unhelpful for you.
Well, it might help you gain more knowledge, sure, but if you've already read it once, it's such a time-consuming process, and the amount that you're going to gain, the amount of extra knowledge you're going to get back from doing that, it's a very, very low return on investment technique. Yeah.
And are you actually understanding what the full chapter is saying as well? So that kind of gets into, you can read and you can skim a 40-page chapter, but if you are not really taking away a level of knowledge from what that chapter is educating you about, then it is going to be unhelpful information for you. Which then also leads into summarization. So if you take a chapter and then you boil it down to a little paragraph, depending on how that is done, it's just, again, a pretty ineffective way to study, because then you are not going to revisit that knowledge and you might not even understand it the way that you summarized it. You could have summarized incorrectly, which you'll actually see a fair amount in undergraduate nursing school level summarizations, which is why you should never really be paying for other people's notes on the internet.
Oh, no.
So I see a lot of nursing students coming in and they want notes from the aesthetic girlies who have like really cute little notes. It's a waste of your money. It looks cute unless you're just like trying to decorate, but buying someone else's summarization of a topic is not going to be an effective studying technique.
Agree. So one really interesting technique that I found very helpful for me along the way, especially as I was learning chemistry, biology, more in-depth pathophysiology, I really like imagery and drawing. I find personally, I think just being able to picture like a molecule in my brain or whatever it may be helps me retain information. So all of these techniques that we're looking at, this all comes out of this like one giant paper that broke down the utility of these techniques. And there was a study on imagery where it was found to be extremely effective for biology students. They were learning the concept of polarity of water molecules, I believe. And when the students were randomized in two different groups, and the students who sat there and pictured the water molecules had the best outcome on test taking, especially compared to the group that did not do any imagery at all. They also, though, took a third group and had them practice drawing it. And they actually had worse recall, which I thought was interesting because I always really enjoyed drawing as a tool. So the takeaway from this is that maybe drawing is like a mechanism of initial understanding, but drawing things over and over as a study technique could be a low utility use of your time. On top of that, when imagery was tested by like different authors to different groups of students, it no longer seemed to be effective. So I would be cautious with how much you focus on imagery. I think if you're in a science class and you're picturing a science concept, this one study, it was small and it was a one-off study, but it showed itself to be extremely, extremely effective for this group of people. So let's not throw it out the window entirely. It could definitely be useful in some places, but if you're learning something else that maybe doesn't quite require it, focus on the science-based techniques that we know work for sure and don't waste your time.
It can be a tool in your tool belt, but not. So for me, in last semester, I used drawing specifically to understand the mechanism of skeletal muscle contraction in relation to like T and T, like the troponin T and like the T and C and how it related to calcium and how the little bands would move across each other. I use that as an initial understanding tool, but I would not use drawing to understand which nerves I need to block for a like carpal tunnel surgery. I need to be able to like verbalize that and then do spaced repetition, which is, I think, specifically related to that study. It can be helpful for certain types of learning. So for chemistry and biology classes where you're really getting down into kind of that like cellular molecular mechanism of action can be helpful. Don't throw it out entirely, but focus more of your time and energy on the stuff that works, which we're going to be getting to shortly.
Yeah. So moving out of things that like
don't really work.
Yeah, that don't really work. I thought this was interesting. Elaborative interrogation and self-explanation. That is that idea of getting into why does something work, talking out a concept and explaining the pieces behind it. The reason why the authors of this big paper that were interrogating study techniques felt that it was moderately effective is because it requires an existing level of knowledge first. So if you're getting into this elaborative interrogation and you're going into like, well, why is, succinylcholine contraindicated after a stroke? And then you are digging into the why, using that as a memorization technique, but you have the mechanism of action of depolarizing muscle relaxants wrong, or you don't understand the sarcoplasmic reticulum or potassium release or the upregulation of receptor sites. I know this is a lot if you haven't studied CRNA school yet, but
I'm in pharm right now and I understood, I just started pharm. So I'm now like, I just learned about upregulation. Anyway, continue.
Yeah. So if you don't understand all the pieces of the puzzle first, or you've memorized them incorrectly, and now you're using that as your way to learn about this drug, you could end up learning the information wrong. So this is only a moderately effective technique because it's only good for higher level learners, and it's only good if you're actually right about the background information. So I actually encourage you guys to, when you're in study group, this is a good time to use that technique because your friends can debate it and correct you, and you could look it up together. In CRNA school, I studied with a group of 4 people total, and there was many times that each of us would have something a little bit wrong, and then with the group, we'd work it out and correct each other and all come to the right answer together. But had I studied that on my own, I would have been memorizing the wrong information.
Absolutely, which I do the exact same thing. I meet with a group of 4. Love you guys. But that is a night before the exam conversation where we meet and we hash out anything. Well, we go through the entire subject matter for the next exam and we teach it to each other and fill in our knowledge gaps. This is not something that we do on day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of learning the material. During those days of the material, we are using the other science-based study techniques to get an understanding of the concept, get a grasp on the concept, really understand and memorize and apply the concept. And then at the very end, we're using that teach-back interrogative method where we're filling in each other's knowledge gaps. So this is where using multiple different techniques kind of comes into play.
So one study technique that was kind of rated as moderately effective by the authors. And it was a word I had never heard before. It was called interleaved practice. And this is a concept where whenever you get saturated with knowledge or bored or tired of one study technique, you move on to a different study technique. And that's something that I did a lot when I was studying for my boards exams. The idea is that when it comes to exam day, you're going to recall information best if you studied it in the way it was presented to you. So when you study in multiple different ways, you're increasing the likelihood of kind of getting that match. You're increasing the likelihood that you'll be able to kind of create a neural pathway that mimics the way it's going to ask to be recalled. This was only investigated in the research with students who are studying math, however. So that's why it only got like a moderately effective rating from the authors of this paper. It hasn't really been sussed out with different groups of students, and so we can't just broadly recommend it because it hasn't been supported in multiple contexts of learning.
That's very interesting about math versus other like biological sciences for recall. All I can speak to is personal experience that I know when I tire from going over my memorization decks that I go through, switching to a YouTube video while I'm watching on the while I'm walking on a treadmill is usually good because it kind of keeps me productive, but I need a break. So even from just like personal experience, I feel like that has to be at least moderately effective because you're just increasing your study time overall, right? So if you can increase how effective you are with your time and use different techniques to kind of hop between projects, I mean, that makes sense to me on paper.
And there's also only so much attention span that we all have. There's always like a limited return on investment. And that's why going back to things like rereading and summarization and highlighting and underlining, your brain can only pay attention to the information for so long. And that's why studying for hours and hours and hours on end is actually very, very low yield for you and could reduce recall. And we'll get more into that towards the end of this video as well.
A little different from interleaved practice, what's the evidence demonstrate about drawing from memory / concept connecting? I believe that's classified usually as mind maps. What does research say about that?
Oh yeah, mind maps and concept maps. So this was actually not really talked about in this like big paper that we're pulling most of this conversation from. But there are several studies about mind maps and concept maps out there. And it's interesting. It's a very popular technique, but that act of the brain dump is only good if you're not cheating. You can't have a textbook open. You can't have the internet open. You need to actually sit there with a blank sheet of paper and write down everything you know. Or it doesn't, and it's also been found that it doesn't matter if you draw it out or make a flow chart or it's just bullet points. It could be anything you want. It has to be active recall from just your brain.
Which then we're going to get more into active recall in a little bit, but that's interesting that I think in nursing school, mind maps were so heavily emphasized as like the be-all end-all for studying techniques. And it's interesting that it's actually not the act of using the mind map that's effective. It is the version of the recall method, which is really kind of interesting. And as we're getting into the best techniques that are supported by research, when I mentioned some of our favorite techniques and our favorite resources for students, which leads us into the sponsor of today's episode. We love and recommend Picmonic because it uses science-based study techniques to improve recall. They have tens of thousands of practice questions that are available for students at the graduate and at the undergraduate level that are going to improve understanding of topics and concepts as a whole. The programming that Picmonic uses automatically incorporates spaced repetition learning, which we are about to dive into as being one of the most effective techniques that you can use as a learner. The visual tools that Picmonic uses are also unique because it helps students understand concepts as a whole as they are practicing their spaced repetition learning. So the adaptable format of these question banks combined with the visual learning tools and with the explanation videos really allow learners to understand concepts from multiple angles, so they end up with understanding instead of just memorization.
Picmonic serves over 1.6 million healthcare students and focuses not only on helping you pass exams, but also on understanding the entire concept and developing clinical skills, which are not only going to help you pass your exams and pass your boards exams, but help you become a better clinician in the future, which is really what's important. We personally checked out Picmonic and love that you can create your own visuals for learning. We also love that they have curriculum not only for nursing students and NCLEX preparation, but they also have programs for nurse practitioners and medical students as well that we thought were extremely applicable for CRNAs in training.
In our bio, and use code Confident Care Academy for 20% off.
All right, so we talked about what is not effective, and we talked about what could be a little bit effective depending on the context if you have a good knowledge base. The two most effective study techniques that we're going to dive into are spaced repetition learning and practice testing. Anna, do you want to tell us a little bit about what you know about spaced repetition learning?
Spaced repetition learning. We actually have another video here that you can check out where we talk a lot and in depth about the forgetting curve. It's this concept that is from the 1800s, but has really held up to the test of time. A learner, when they hear a lecture or when they read a concept or they read through their textbook, they forget about 90% of what they learned in that lecture within 24 hours. I don't know about you, but I would like to retain more than 10% of what I just sat in 4 hours of lecture for. So how do you improve that retention and how do you decrease that plateau of knowledge drop-off? Spaced repetition learning. Spaced repetition learning is something that actually has a little bit of a learning curve as well to learning how to do. This is something where you're going to essentially understand the concept first. You have to have an understanding before you memorize. So when you understand, that's the very first step of learning, then you are going to disseminate that topic or that exam worth of information, and you're going to create a program for yourself where you revisit topics and things that you need to memorize throughout a scheduled period of time, where you are ramping up the intensity or ramping apart the frequency with which you're revisiting old topics to really create those neural pathways and connections so that you are practicing recall. So when exam day comes, you know the topics at hand, you're going to perform well on exams and also understand the topics at hand. This was done, I think, when I was in nursing school, primarily through Quizlet and just flashcards. There are now a couple of learning tools available on the market that students have a strong preference for. Anki is one of those, and also just general broad boards prep, like Apex Anesthesia is another one that people are using often.
And Picmonic.
And Picmonic is another one particularly for pharmacology that people are utilizing. What matters is that you're going to utilize spaced repetition learning correctly. And there's a lot of pitfalls that students have here as well. And then before we get into kind of the pitfalls, which I can just really talk about personal experience with how I learned what I was not doing effectively with spaced repetition learning, let's talk about the research that demonstrates how and why this works.
So in this paper where they're looking at all of these different learning techniques, instead of calling it spaced repetition, they called it distributed practice, but it's the same concept. They had this really interesting study that, again, we will link below at the bottom of this video. It was a really big study. They looked at introductory to psychology students across 9 different colleges and universities. So this is like a pretty big sample size. And so they had these students take quizzes with either more or less retrieval practice and more or less spacing between their practice questions before they took their final exam. Students who took quizzes multiple times, meaning practice quizzes multiple times before an exam, actually performed worse than students who only did one practice quiz before their actual exam.
Wow.
There was also a significant effect of spacing on exam scores, meaning that when students did practice quizzes and had more space before the exam and more space apart between review sessions, they did better than when students did it right before an exam. There was also an interaction between retrieval practice and spacing. So the students who did the worst out of everybody were people who did more retrieval practice, so more practice quizzes, and did not space it out. They actually did the worst out of everyone at all. So that essentially leads us into why you should not cram or overdo your studying, and how oversaturating yourself with too many rounds of practice tests and practice quizzes could actually decrease your performance overall, because you're essentially fatiguing your brain.
That study is so interesting because it perfectly mirrors my experience in learning how to study at a graduate student level. So I just finished first year of CRNA school. I'm now a second year RRNA. Woohoo! But really only the last semester was truly didactic. So I've really now had one true semester of like the core CRNA school classes. There's a steep learning curve there. I will have a whole separate video about that topic alone. If you want to watch that video, that'll be on my personal YouTube channel or here, either way. But the boiled down version of what I learned was when you have like 3-4 hour lectures that you are tested on, you have to have a base. First thing, you have to have a basis of understanding before you can get into memorization. So I tried to hop directly feet first into this spaced repetition learning thing without fully understanding the concepts at hand. And then I ended up with hundreds of flashcards that didn't really teach me to think at the big picture level. So if you go straight from lecture to making flashcards and you kind of skip and bypass the understanding piece, you're going to be floundering and you're not going to perform very well in the exams. So you really have to understand first before you start with the spaced repetition learning. The second thing I learned with that is that timing and spacing out your spaced repetition learning, like so your flashcards, is important. There is a whole study about this as well in relation to that forgetting curve about where you have either your physical, tangible pile of flashcards, you learn it, and then when you understand it, you move it to the next box, and then that next box you review like every 4 days or once a week or something. And then when you get those right, you move them to the less frequent box, and then that is like once a week or once every 10 days or something like that. So then when you are coming up on exam time, you have created all of these neural connections and you are increasing the timing and the interval between when you're reviewing those flashcards. So you're not just sitting there going over the same stuff over and over and over again. And the other thing that I'm learning now with anesthesia is that it's all cumulative. And so my exams are cumulative, right? Because it doesn't make sense to teach a RRNA or an SRNA all of your inhalational anesthetics and then for them to not have to know it in 2 weeks because you have to know all this stuff in the OR, right? So the next 2 semesters of all of our learning, everything is sequential and integrated. So this spaced repetition learning is going to be even more essential as I go into my next and following semesters as I'm learning the pharmacology and the pathophysiology of anesthesia. So this stuff is like so relevant to all of the RRNAs out there. It's all because anesthesia is cumulative, right? You don't get to forget how to position a patient prone because that was 2 semesters ago. You don't get to forget epidurals because that was last semester. You got to know all of it, right? So this is that's
especially when
so
you hit
relevant.
clinical. If you don't know like your basics of anesthesia on day 1 when you're inducing a patient, good luck.
And we want y'all to be prepared, right? So that's part of why we at Confident Care Academy create all these educational resources. We want y'all to have these resources available to you. We have membership for people who are anywhere along the nursing journey, whether you're a nursing student, students get 50% off all the time. If you are a new grad nurse, if you are a nurse educator, if you are an experienced critical care nurse, if you're an RRNA, we create all these educational resources for y'all so that you can be really well prepared, hopefully from day 1, going into the OR.
We have to give you guys our last science-based study tip.
Mm-hmm.
Practice testing. We already kind of alluded to this with the spaced repetition learning study, but practice questions and practice testing are what are going to help you recall information in the way that you studied it, right? You have to form the neural connections in the correct way. They also force you to ask those why questions. They force you to dig deeper. And from personal experience, think back to any test that you got an exam question wrong on. I bet you never forgot it once you learned the answer.
Very true. So that means when you're taking your practice tests, read the rationales about why you got the answer wrong. Don't just do practice questions and then not look and not learn from all of those questions as well, which is a great resource for all of you learners out there.
It's also such a time-saving study technique. Again, I think the biggest thing that most people do wrong is they think that they have to put a ton of time into studying and they feel guilty if they don't. And they'll do that thing where they kind of like have the study Olympics. They'll compare with their classmates,
Oh my
how many
gosh.
hours did you study this week? And the person who's studying the most is actually, they think that they're winning, but they're actually losing.
They're losing.
They're probably getting worse grades, or maybe their grades are good, but they're having worse retention overall because you not only have lost time that could have been dedicated to sleeping, eating a healthy meal,
Working out.
being with loved ones, you're actually scientifically getting worse retrieval in the long run because you're saturating your brain.
Free yourself from the shackles of thinking you need to study 9 hours a day. Even in CRNA school, free yourself from that, because at the end of the day, if you are studying in a science-based way, you do not need to study. Whether you are a medical student, an RRNA, a PA student, a nursing student, you never need to be studying 9 hours a day.
Except for when you're studying for your boards exam.
Okay, that is a very brief period of time when you are studying for boards. Yes, for about a 6-week period. But throughout your training, if you're studying like 9-10 hours a day, I'm going to hot take, I think you're not using science-based study techniques. If you're truly spending 9 hours a day, you should be utilizing these science-based study techniques so that you then also are going to perform better at the end of the day and have time to cook a good meal, go on a walk your dog, work out. And if you are utilizing the resources that are available to you, you should be able to do that.
Remember, guys, it's a marathon, not a sprint. And at the end of the day, the goal is for you to be a good clinician. Like, yes, we want you to pass your exams and do well on exams so you can move on. You need, in almost every CRNA program I've ever heard of, you need an 82% average or higher to even move forward with the program. So, of course, it's important to succeed academically, but no one's going to look at your grades after you graduate. So the end goal is for you to understand clinically, be able to look at the big picture, and memorize for the long game, right? You need to use this in the OR to keep your patients safe. It doesn't really matter if you get a 99 or a 97 on the exam, right? We need you to have more effective learning tools that are going to help you integrate that into the long-term memory.
And when it comes down to it, they also don't care if you made an 86 versus a 91, especially if you're trading those 3 little points for additional hands-on learning time, right?
Absolutely. That is a tirade that I will get to on another episode where I love to, really emphasize to students, like, if you have a choice at the end of the day, like let's say you have an exam coming up and you have the choice between studying for your exam or studying for clinical, you should be choosing clinical every single day because you have a patient on the table and you have a responsibility to keep them safe. So if you don't understand the pathophysiology of what's going on with them, the surgery, their own comorbidities, the drugs that they're on, the drugs you're about to give, you could kill that person.
Mm.
And ethically, you should feel more anxious about that than about whether you get an A or a B. And if you don't have that priority, I question if you really should be in the operating room at all. So this is like...
It's heavy stuff, but it matters.
It's something that I like to help students refocus on because it's easy to get lost in the weeds, especially when you're new to grad school. Most of you guys are overachievers and you want your straight A's, but I need you to remember that there's patience here. So again, back to the reason why we did this episode, we want you to free yourselves from the shackles of that stress, that anxiety. We want you to be effective and we want you to succeed. And we also want to make you strong clinicians.
And when you utilize all of these tools, that is what you will be at the end of the day. You'll be a strong clinician. And for us, at the end of the day, it circles back to we're here for the patients. We're not here to make a 98 on an exam, even though that can be a nice distraction at the time. We're here to really learn so that we can provide the best possible care to the people who are, in the operating room on that table. And we get to be with them every single step of the way.
Guys, thanks so much for joining us. Do us a favor, like and subscribe so you don't miss a video. It really helps us out a lot. Comment below what you want to see next time. We'll see you there.